Thanks so much for watching or listening to this second episode of the Jesus Family Orientation Series. In this episode, we're going to try to answer the question, how do I start a Jesus family? And we're going to look at this question a couple of different ways. We're going to start by talking about who can start a Jesus family, and then we're going to answer the question, where do I begin? And then we're going to finish up with, what's the ask? So let's start with who can start a Jesus family, because the answer might surprise you. Anyone. Anyone can start a Jesus family, and I know that might be surprising, especially if you grew up in a religious household, but this is true to the new covenant that Jesus began. Let's take a quick history lesson, if you don't mind. In the old covenant, the old way that God related to the nation of Israel, recorded in what we know of as the Old Testament of our Bibles, there were very strict rules of who could and could not be in charge of the religious enterprise of the Israelite religion. You had priests and Levites, an all-male class of people, and they were the only ones that could run the programs and take care of the buildings and offer the sacrifices and intercede between God and humanity. But when Jesus came, he didn't do what you would have expected. You would have expected Jesus, if he was going to continue or even improve upon the old covenant, to go down to the local rabbi school and scoop up the 12 top prospects and say, come on guys, we're doing something better. But he didn't continue the old covenant. Instead, he launched a brand new covenant, as he told us in the Last Supper. And like everything else, the rules for who could and could not be in charge of this thing changed. So that's why I say the answer is anyone. Anyone who follows Jesus can start a Jesus family, because you're not starting a church. You're starting a family. And if you still think that you might not be qualified, let me introduce you to some of Jesus's closest followers. If you don't think you know enough, or you don't have enough of an education, or you don't know enough about the Bible at this point, well, let me introduce you to Peter. Peter is one of Jesus's main disciples, known as the 12. And by most accounts, he didn't have an education. Most scholars believe he was uneducated and probably even illiterate. So if you have more than a second grade education, well, then you have more of an education than Peter, the guy Jesus handed the keys off to the whole thing. And you might say, well, I have an education, but my past is too traumatic. There's too many skeletons in my closet. My past is too dark. Well, let me introduce you to Mary Magdalene. Again, one of Jesus's closest followers who shows up time and time again in the Gospels. The Gospels say that Jesus drove out 7 demons from her. So if you want to talk about a traumatic past, well, she's got one. And in John chapter 20, the day that Jesus rose from the dead and thereby validated everything that he ever taught about God and humanity and salvation and the way to heaven, the very first person, the very first human that saw the resurrected Christ was none other than Mary Magdalene. And Jesus told Mary Magdalene to go and tell the disciples about his resurrection, making Mary Magdalene the first evangelist. So if God can use Mary Magdalene, then God can use you. If you think, well, maybe 20 years ago God could have used me, but I walked away from religion. I grew up in church, but I walked away. Well, let me introduce you to Matthew, who, when we find him in Matthew 9, was a tax collector, but you find out more about his story, especially from his gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, that he knew the Old Testament. Most likely he was raised in church and walked away. And yet he came back and became one of the 12. If God can use Matthew, who walked away from church, then God can use you. And even if you are a churched person, God can use you as well. You might know the story of Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul the Apostle. He wasn't just a church person, he was the churchiest church person in the history of church people. He said, I was a Jew of Jews, circumcised on the 8th day, of the tribe of Benjamin, of the sect of the Pharisees, the most religiously zealous sect of the Jewish religion at that time. And God redeemed him and said, I'm going to teach you a new way to live and a new way to interact with me through Jesus. So if God could use Peter and Mary Magdalene and Matthew and Paul, God can use you. So who can start a Jesus family? Anyone. And by that, I mean anyone, even you. The second question I want to look at is, where do I begin? Okay, let's say you or excited and you're like, okay, I'm in. What do I actually do? Well, I would say a couple things. First, I would say study up. Read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Read the stories of the life and the teaching and the death and resurrection of Jesus again and again. That's the apostles' teaching. And you can look at resources on our website, on this podcast, because this is such a new teaching for so many folks that you might need a little bit for it to soak in and sink in. So you can go to our website and look and watch or listen to the other episodes of the Jesus Family podcast. So study up about what this new covenant is and how it's different than the way maybe you've approached church or been familiar with church in the past. So study up. The second thing I would say, if you want to begin, is pray. Just pray a simple prayer. Say, Jesus, do you want me to start a Jesus Family? God, do you want me to start a Jesus Family? And see what he says. And another great prayer to pray would be, God, if you want me to start a Jesus Family, would you show me people? Would you show me people that I can invite to be a part of this family with me? So pray, and then lastly, watch. Because if you pray, watch for God to answer and see how he answers you. Now, just so you know, anyone can be a part of the Jesus Family, but we're not necessarily going for the churched people. If you know someone who is actively involved in their church and they love the church and they love their church, well, then leave well enough alone. Who we're going for is we're going for those on the outsides, those on the margins, those who have walked away from the church. They're interested in following Jesus, but they're not necessarily interested in being a part of a traditional church. Those are the folks. See if God brings any of those folks to mind. Friends, neighbors, coworkers. Maybe you can do a social media blast and just say, I'm interested in starting a Jesus Family. Do you want to join? So that's the second question. The final question is, okay, what's the ask? Like, okay, Josh, I'm fine with all this. What do I actually say? Well, you could say a couple of different things. You could just say, hey, I'm interested in starting a Jesus Family, and I thought about you, and I wanted to know if you would like to be a part. Their response is probably going to be, okay, I'm intrigued. What's a Jesus Family? And then you can tell them about the Jesus Family, or if you still don't know the words to say and you still don't feel like you can do a good enough job to explain it, you can send them the first video in this family orientation series. What is a Jesus Family? That's designed to be sent to give a quick 7-minute overview of who we are, what we're about, and what makes us different. So you can just ask, I'm wanting to start a Jesus Family, and I want to know if you would like to be involved. And if they say, I'm interested, what do we do now? Well, then the next step would be, I'm having dinner at my house. I'm having a Jesus Family dinner at my house, and I want to know if you'd like to come over to my house for dinner. So you invite them to a family dinner at your house, wherever you live, or wherever you choose to gather. So that's the ask. Do you want to be a part of a Jesus Family? And would you like to come over to my place for dinner? And so the good follow-up question is, okay, what does a family dinner actually look like? If that's the main time that we come together as the family, as the Jesus Family, what does that actually look like? And that's the subject of the very next episode. So keep watching or listening, and thanks.